On the morning of August 15, 1945, in a cramped basement office beneath the smoldering ruins of Tokyo, Captain Takeo Yoshikawa sat surrounded by mountains of charred documents and broken cipher machines. Outside, the city lay in ashes. Inside, he faced a truth more devastating than any incendiary bomb. For 5 years, every secret his nation had transmitted through the supposedly impenetrable purple cipher had been an open book to American cryptanalysts. The war was over, and with it came the crushing realization that Japan had been fighting blind against an enemy who could see every move before it happened. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Yoshikawa and his colleagues were about to discover would shatter every assumption they had held about their cryptographic superiority, revealing an intelligence failure so complete, so total, that it had shaped the outcome of the entire Pacific conflict without them ever suspecting the depth of their exposure. In the spring of 1940, while Europe burned and America maintained its nervous neutrality, a team of mathematicians and linguists working in a nondescript building in Washington had achieved what Japanese military planners considered impossible. They had broken Purple, the diplomatic cipher machine that Tokyo believed was absolutely secure. The Americans called their operation Magic, and it would become one of the most closely guarded secrets of the entire global conflict. Commander Yamamoto Hideaki had personally overseen the implementation of Purple across Japan's diplomatic network in 1939. A graduate of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy and a specialist in communications security, he had supreme confidence in the machine's complexity. Purple used telephone stepping switches instead of rotors, creating what Japanese engineers calculated as 10 to the power of 20 possible key combinations. The mathematics alone, Yamamoto believed, made unauthorized decryption a practical impossibility. On December 7, 1941, that confidence seemed justified when Japanese carrier aircraft achieved complete tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor. What Yamamoto did not know was that American cryptanalysts had been reading Tokyo's diplomatic traffic for over a year. The attack succeeded not because magic had failed, but because of bureaucratic delays in processing the intercepts and fundamental disagreements about what the decoded messages actually meant. The Japanese interpreted America's lack of readiness as proof that Purple remained secure. In reality, it was evidence of something far more dangerous to Tokyo: American overconfidence in their own defensive preparations. Lieutenant Agnes Meyer Driscoll had led the initial breakthrough against Purple in the autumn of 1940. Working at the Navy's cryptanalysis office, she had spent 18 months studying the patterns of encrypted Japanese diplomatic messages, searching for the mathematical fingerprints that would reveal the machine's internal logic. Her team worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, filling notebooks with frequency distributions and probable plaintext attacks. The moment of breakthrough came on September 20, 1940, when Driscoll's team successfully decrypted a complete Purple message for the first time. The plaintext revealed routine diplomatic correspondence about trade negotiations, but its significance was immeasurable. Within 3 months, American cryptanalysts had reconstructed the entire Purple machine without ever having seen one. They built their own analog using American telephone equipment, creating a device that could decrypt Tokyo's most sensitive diplomatic communications in near real time. By mid-1942, the flow of decrypted Japanese messages had become a torrent. Army and Navy cryptanalysts were processing an average of 75 Purple messages daily, along with hundreds of lower-level diplomatic and military communications encrypted in other Japanese codes. The intelligence windfall was staggering. American commanders knew Japanese fleet movements before some Japanese captains received their orders. They understood Tokyo's strategic priorities, diplomatic negotiating positions, and assessments of American strength. Yet in Tokyo, the keepers of Japan's cryptographic systems remained serenely confident. Colonel Nishimura Sadao, chief of the Army's Communications Security Section, conducted regular security reviews of Japan's cipher systems. His reports consistently concluded that Purple and the military's operational codes remained secure against foreign cryptanalysis. The mathematical complexity was simply too great, he argued, for any nation to overcome without capturing an actual machine. What Nishimura failed to understand was the scale of America's cryptanalytic effort. By 1943, over 10,000 personnel were engaged in signals intelligence operations across the Army and Navy. The operation at Arlington Hall, the Army's cryptanalysis center, employed more than 7,000 people, most of them women with mathematics backgrounds recruited from colleges across America. They worked in shifts around the clock, processing intercepts from listening stations scattered across the Pacific. The human cost of this invisible success was measured not in casualties, but in battles that never happened and invasions that succeeded with fewer losses than predicted. When American submarines began sinking Japanese merchant vessels with devastating efficiency in 1943 and 1944, Tokyo's naval staff attributed it to improved American submarine tactics and perhaps some leakage from compromised harbor security. The possibility that American commanders were reading encrypted shipping movement orders seemed beyond consideration. Captain Takeshi Naito commanded the cipher section aboard the battleship Yamato during 1944. He personally encoded and decoded hundreds of operational messages using the Navy's primary fleet code. After the conflict, he would recall his absolute certainty that the code remained secure. The evidence, he believed, was clear. If Americans could read Japanese naval communications, they would have achieved far more devastating results than they did. The fact that Japanese forces sometimes achieved tactical surprise proved the codes were holding. This reasoning, logical as it appeared, missed the essential truth. American commanders did achieve devastating results, sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of Japanese shipping and intercepting fleet movements with uncanny accuracy. But they carefully managed their use of signals intelligence to avoid tipping their hand. When American forces appeared to stumble into Japanese positions by accident, it was often because commanders had deliberately introduced randomness to their operations, making some moves based on intelligence and others on apparent chance, creating a pattern that seemed consistent with normal reconnaissance and patrol operations rather than foreknowledge. The deception reached its peak during the Midway operation in June 1942. American cryptanalysts had decrypted Japanese naval messages revealing plans for a major operation against target AF. To confirm that AF meant Midway, they arranged for the base to transmit an uncoded message reporting water supply problems. Within days, a Japanese intercept reported that AF was short of fresh water. Admiral Nimitz positioned his carriers based on precise knowledge of Japanese timing and approach routes. The resulting engagement saw 4 Japanese fleet carriers lost against 1 American carrier, a catastrophic defeat that Tokyo's planners could not explain through normal operational factors. Even after Midway, Japanese communications security officers found ways to explain American success without acknowledging cryptographic compromise. Perhaps a reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the fleet. Perhaps a submarine had detected their approach. Perhaps American radio direction finding had been more effective than estimated. The possibility that their codes were broken remained, in their assessment, mathematically implausible. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Komura worked in Tokyo's Central Communications Intelligence Office throughout 1943 and 44. His job was to monitor foreign radio traffic and assess potential threats to Japanese communications security. He filed regular reports noting increased American radio intercept activity and growing sophistication in American signals intelligence operations. His recommendations included periodic code changes and enhanced security procedures. What Komura did not recommend, because it seemed unnecessary, was a fundamental review of whether Purple itself might be compromised. The machine's complexity, combined with the absence of any captured units in American hands, made penetration seem impossible. Tokyo did change some military codes periodically, but these changes were tactical updates, not responses to suspected compromise. Purple remained in continuous use throughout the conflict, transmitting Tokyo's most sensitive diplomatic communications to ambassadors and military attachés around the world. By 1944, the intelligence advantage was producing results on an industrial scale. American submarines, were sinking Japanese merchant vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. The shipping routes that American submarines patrolled with such devastating effect were often selected based on decrypted messages about convoy routes and timing. Japanese naval officers noted the effectiveness of American submarine operations, but attributed it to the vast number of submarines America could deploy and the increasing difficulty of providing adequate convoy escorts. In the diplomatic sphere, the intelligence advantage was equally decisive. When Japanese diplomats in neutral capitals reported on their conversations with potential allies or their assessments of American intentions, those reports arrived in Washington as quickly as they reached Tokyo. American negotiators knew Japan's bottom line before entering discussions. They understood which diplomatic initiatives were serious and which were merely exploratory. The entire diplomatic dimension of the Pacific conflict was a game where one side played with revealed cards while thinking them hidden. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. Between 1940 and 1945, American cryptanalysts decoded and translated approximately 6,000 purple messages. Add to this the hundreds of thousands of lower-level military and diplomatic messages decrypted from other Japanese codes, and the intelligence picture becomes almost overwhelming. American commanders possessed a window into Japanese decision-making that was unprecedented in military history. Yet the security held, not through elaborate deception schemes or complex counterintelligence operations, but through simple compartmentalization and discipline. The distribution list for magic intercepts was tiny, limited to a handful of senior commanders and civilian leaders. Processing centers operated under absolute secrecy, with severe penalties for any security breach. Personnel who handled the material understood that revealing the source could cost American lives and potentially lose the advantage that was shortening the conflict. Captain Yoshikawa, sitting in his basement office in August 1945, had spent the final weeks of the conflict burning documents and preparing for occupation. The order to destroy cryptographic materials and cipher machines had come through days before the surrender announcement. He had personally supervised the demolition of purple machines and the burning of code books. It was routine security procedure during a defeat. Deny the enemy access to your cryptographic systems. What made the moment devastating was not the destruction itself, but what he learned in the weeks following the surrender. American occupation forces arrived with specific questions about Japanese communications security. Their interrogators possessed detailed knowledge of cipher procedures and machine specifications that could only come from one source. They had been reading the traffic all along. The questions were not attempts to gather intelligence, but confirmations of what they already knew. Commander Yamamoto Hideaki was among the first Japanese cryptographic officers to grasp the full scope of the compromise. Brought in for questioning by American intelligence officers, he expected discussions about how the machines worked and how codes were generated. Instead, the Americans showed him decoded transcripts of messages he had personally encrypted years earlier. They knew the settings, the procedures, the security protocols. They had not captured this information recently. They had possessed it for years. The psychological impact on Japanese intelligence officers was profound. Every operational decision, every strategic move, every diplomatic initiative had been conducted in what they believed was secrecy. Now they understood that American commanders had been reading their mail for 5 years. The Battle of Midway, the submarine campaign, the island-hopping strategy, all had benefited from intelligence that Tokyo thought secure. The efficiency of American operations, which Japanese officers had attributed to industrial strength and tactical skill, had a simpler explanation. The Americans had known what was coming. Lieutenant Commander Komura's reaction, recorded in post-conflict debriefings, captured the collective sense of disbelief. He had spent years monitoring American signals intelligence activities, filing reports on their capabilities, and recommending security enhancements. Yet he had never suspected that the fundamental assumption underlying all his work, that purple was secure, was wrong. The mathematical complexity that seemed to guarantee security had proven no barrier to a sufficiently resourced and determined cryptanalytic effort. The technical explanations, when American cryptanalysts finally shared them, only deepened the shock. The Japanese had assumed that without capturing an actual Purple machine, reconstruction would be impossible. They had underestimated both the mathematical sophistication of American cryptanalysts and the industrial capacity to apply brute force analysis at scale. Agnes Meyer Driscoll and her colleagues had not needed a captured machine. They had used pure cryptanalysis, pattern recognition, and mathematical insight to rebuild Purple from intercepted messages alone. Colonel Nishimura Sadao, the officer who had certified Purple's security in countless reports, found himself confronting a career built on catastrophic misjudgment. His security reviews had been thorough by conventional standards. He had verified procedures, tested encryption randomness, and confirmed that no machines had fallen into enemy hands. What he had failed to consider was that conventional standards were inadequate against an opponent willing to deploy thousands of trained cryptanalysts and the most advanced analytical machinery available. The human stories behind the decryption effort emerged slowly in the post-conflict period. Japanese officers learned about the women mathematicians at Arlington Hall who had processed their messages. They heard about the 24-hour operations at listening stations from Australia to Alaska. They discovered the elaborate security procedures that had kept magic secret, even as it influenced every major decision in the Pacific Theater. The scope of the American effort dwarfed anything in Japanese cryptanalytic operations. What stunned Japanese intelligence officers most was not that their codes had been broken. Codes are always vulnerable to sufficiently determined attack, but that the compromise had remained undetected for so long. In retrospect, they could identify moments when they should have suspected penetration. The frequency with which American forces appeared in exactly the right place at the right time, the uncanny accuracy of American intelligence assessments, the effectiveness of the submarine campaign against merchant shipping. All could have been warning signs, but cognitive bias and faith in mathematical complexity had prevented proper assessment. Captain Takeshi Naito, the fleet cipher officer, who had been so confident in his code's security, spent months after the surrender reviewing naval operations in light of the revealed intelligence compromise. Battle after battle took on new meaning. The timing of American carrier strikes, the positioning of submarine patrol areas, the targeting of supply convoys, all showed patterns consistent with advanced knowledge of Japanese plans. The patterns had been there all along, visible to anyone willing to consider the possibility of comprehensive cryptographic failure. But that possibility had seemed too remote to warrant serious consideration. The diplomatic implications were equally staggering. Japan's ambassador to Moscow had reported throughout 1945 on his discussions with Soviet officials about possible mediation to end the conflict. Those reports, Tokyo now learned, had been read in Washington as quickly as in Tokyo. American leaders had known that Japan was seeking a negotiated settlement through Soviet intermediaries. They had known Japan's terms and bottom lines. The entire endgame of the Pacific conflict had played out with American leadership reading both sides' positions. Some Japanese officers found bitter irony in the security that had protected magic. The same compartmentalization and discipline that Japanese military culture prized had worked against them. American forces had maintained secrecy through exactly the kind of hierarchical control and need-to-know restrictions that Japanese forces respected. The Americans had simply been better at it, or perhaps more motivated, knowing that the intelligence advantage could shorten the conflict and save lives. For the cryptanalysts and communications officers who had operated Japan's cipher systems, the revelation transformed their understanding of the entire conflict. They had not simply lost battles or campaigns. They had fought a conflict where the opponent could read their strategy in real time. It was as if they had been playing chess against an opponent who could see their planned moves before they made them. The outcome, in retrospect, was never truly in doubt once the industrial and resource advantages combined with total intelligence superiority. The technical post-mortems were particularly painful. Japanese cryptographers had believed that the stepping switch technology in Purple created a more complex encryption system than the rotor machines used by other nations. In some ways, they were correct. Purple was indeed different from German Enigma-style machines, but different did not mean more secure. The mathematical principles underlying cryptographic security applied equally to stepping switches and rotors. Complexity alone, without proper understanding of vulnerabilities to statistical and mathematical attack, provided false confidence rather than real security. What Japanese intelligence officers said when they realized Americans had been reading their codes since 1940 varied by individual temperament and position. Some expressed grudging admiration for the scale and sophistication of the American cryptanalytic effort. Others focused on the operational implications, reassessing every engagement and decision through the lens of compromised communications. Still others experienced something close to despair at the realization that their professional expertise had been so completely overcome. Commander Yamamoto Hideaki, in a debriefing session 3 months after the surrender, provided perhaps the most succinct summary. When asked how he felt learning that Purple had been compromised since 1940, he paused for a long moment before responding. Everything, he said quietly, had been built on an assumption that proved false. The machine was too complex, the mathematics too difficult, the chance of reconstruction without a captured device too remote. Those assumptions had seemed reasonable, even conservative. They had been catastrophically wrong. The broader lesson, which Japanese military analysts would spend years absorbing, went beyond cryptography to the fundamental nature of the conflict. Japan had entered the Pacific engagement believing that fighting spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantages. The intelligence dimension revealed how thoroughly that calculation had failed. American forces had combined industrial strength with intellectual superiority, applying mathematical and analytical resources on a scale that Japanese planners had not imagined possible. For the Americans who had worked in the cryptanalytics centers, the post-conflict revelations brought a different kind of satisfaction. Years of grinding mathematical work, of processing endless intercepts, of maintaining absolute secrecy, even as colleagues wondered what the mysterious operations were accomplishing. All had contributed to shortening the conflict. The intelligence had saved lives, both American and Japanese, by helping American commanders make better decisions and avoid costly mistakes. Agnes Meyer Driscoll, whose breakthrough on Purple in 1940 had initiated the entire program, retired from naval service after the conflict ended. Her contribution remained classified for decades, known only to a small circle of cryptanalytic professionals and military historians. When the Purple story finally became public in the 1970s, she was in her 80s, long past the fame and recognition that might have come from such an achievement. She had done the work not for recognition, but because it needed doing, applying her mathematical gifts to a problem of supreme national importance. The thousands of other cryptanalysts and support personnel who had made magic possible similarly returned to civilian life with their contributions classified. The women mathematicians of Arlington Hall went back to teaching or research or raising families, unable to tell even close relatives what they had accomplished. The listening station operators scattered to posts around the world, maintaining their silence about the intercepts they had collected. The security that had protected the operation during the conflict continued protecting it for decades afterward. Captain Yoshikawa, amid the ruins of Tokyo, absorbed these truths and began the difficult process of rebuilding both personally and professionally. The cryptographic systems he had trusted were revealed as vulnerable. The conflict he had fought was shown to have been even more one-sided than the material balance suggested. But understanding the scope of the intelligence failure also provided a strange kind of clarity. Japan had not lost simply through lack of fighting spirit or tactical mistakes. They had fought against an opponent with overwhelming advantages in every dimension, industrial, technological, and intellectual. The full story of Magic and Purple would remain classified for 3 decades after the conflict ended. When details finally emerged in the 1970s, former Japanese intelligence officers were elderly men, their careers long over. Some granted interviews to historians, describing their shock at learning the extent of the compromise. Others declined to discuss it. The memory of professional failure too painful even decades later. The wound to professional pride never fully healed for those who had certified the security of systems that proved catastrophically vulnerable. For students of intelligence and military history, the Purple Compromise became a case study in the dangers of overconfidence in technical solutions. The Japanese cryptographers were not incompetent or careless. They had created genuinely complex encryption systems and implemented them with proper security procedures. What they had failed to anticipate was the scale of effort an opponent might bring to bear against even the most complex codes, and the power of mathematical analysis when applied with sufficient resources and determination. The strategic implications extended beyond any single engagement or campaign. Intelligence superiority had shaped American decision-making at every level, from submarine patrol assignments to carrier task force operations to diplomatic strategy. It had allowed American commanders to concentrate forces at decisive points with confidence that came from reading enemy plans. It had enabled the efficient use of limited resources by revealing where those resources would be most effective. The intelligence advantage, combined with industrial strength, had created a synergy that Japan could not overcome. In the decades following the conflict, as cryptography evolved into computer-based systems and the mathematics of encryption became increasingly sophisticated, the Purple story remained relevant. The fundamental lesson endured. No matter how complex the encryption system, it remains vulnerable to determined cryptanalytic attack backed by sufficient resources. Security lies not in complexity alone, but in understanding the mathematical foundations of cryptographic strength and the potential capabilities of adversaries. The men who had operated Japan's cryptographic systems during the conflict carried their knowledge into the post-conflict world. Some advised on the reconstruction of Japanese communications infrastructure. Others moved into civilian telecommunications. A few became educators, teaching the next generation while carefully avoiding mention of their most important professional experience, which remained classified. They had lived through one of history's most complete intelligence failures, and that experience shaped their understanding of both the possibilities and limitations of technological security. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.